for the first talk of the day here at the green stage. When it comes to mobile app development, our first speaker has walked the walk at Uber and literally wrote the book titled Building Mobile Apps at Scale. He is here to share some of the challenges and practices that come with growing a mobile app development team to hundreds of engineers. Please welcome Gergely Orosz.
Hey everyone, it's great to be here on Craft Conference. And let me start a little bit before we jump into the story about going from one to many engineers. Let me do a little bit of introduction for those of you who might not know me. I have worked at a bunch of different places, most recently at Skype/Microsoft, at Skyscanner, and the past few years at Uber. I spent a bit more than 4 years at Uber. I worked on 2 separate app rewrites, rewriting the Rider app from our old legacy code base to Swift and moving to a new architecture, doing the same at the driver app as well. I joined as an Android engineer. I went to being an engineering manager where I ended up heading up multiple teams and becoming a manager of managers in the end. I wrote the book called Building Mobile Apps at Scale, 39 Engineering Challenges that talks a little bit about some overlay with the topic that we're going to talk about today. And you can grab this book at mobileatscale.com. A bunch of the chapters are also available freely online if you're interested. What we're going to talk about today, though, is a journey from having an idea for a mobile app, starting to work on it with a few people, one person, all the way to that idea becoming really successful, it being a big business, and a team of more than 100 mobile engineers working on the same app. When I say more than 100 mobile engineers, I mean 100 iOS engineers and 100 Android engineers. Or I guess if you're cross-platform, that might complicate it, but we're going to stick to that premise of just 100 engineers on just one app. And we're going to do this journey going from the very well-known and kind of, not really scary parts of starting off with the Hello World app and how you do it. It's a very well-explored space. And we're going to get to those peaks that honestly few companies and people get to, just because it's hard to get there. It's hard to make a business case to hire and employ more than 100, let's say, iOS engineers. So we're going to take this journey one step at a time. We're going to talk about what typically happens at 1 to 3 engineers. So typically at more of a startup phase, at 3 to 10, 10 to 100, 10 to 30, 30 to 100, and then above 100 engineers working on the same application. I'm not talking about these engineers working on multiple apps at a company on the exact same app. So that's going to be pretty exciting. And I'll tell a story that might be familiar to some of you who pay attention to startup lands. So let's start with the beginning of this journey, where in the early days, there's 1, maximum 3 engineers working on the same app. And we have big plans. Like we have an idea, we want to do this, and if this thing becomes big, it's going to be big, but it can also fail. And first, we need to ship something. And I'm going to tell the story that I'm very familiar with, and one of the very few companies who has gone from 1 person to all the way to hundreds, which is Uber, and where I have firsthand experience. So how did this first stage happen at Uber? Travis, or I think the previous CEO of Uber, hired contractors, I think 1 or 2, to build an app, and they told them just do it quickly, as quickly as possible, and even faster, and even faster. And in a few months, they built a prototype of an application that looked a little bit like this. It was a map, a Google map with a pin on it. This you could kind of tap on requesting a pickup. Once you went there, getting out of the way, you saw cars move. They just kind of moved over the map, but it worked. And this took I think 3 months to build, again, hiring a few contractors. There were no full-time employees at this point at Uber. Now, after this became successful, Uber raised, I think, $1 million, and then another round. They said, okay, hold on, we should probably hire some people. And Uber did hire some people. And those people looked at the code base and they said, we cannot work with this. Like, what is this? It's a mess. It was built by contractors who were paid to, just to get it done really quickly. So the team started again. They just threw out the code base and they started from scratch. With the first full-time mobile hire made this decision, we need to have more stable foundations to build an actual business. They chose a sensible architecture, something that looked good. it wasn't too much of an overthink, because again, at this point, there was one full-time mobile engineer. His name was Jordan Bonnet. I worked with him for a very long time at Uber in Amsterdam. And so he told me this story. They kind of did code reviews a little bit when there were two people. They started to do it, but I mean, they also have a rough architecture approach. Jordan had a lot of ideas on how to do things, and they kind of followed it. They put some CI/CD in place that they initially didn't use, but later started to use. But this was kind of it up to 3 engineers. This is, by the way, how the whole Uber team looked: mobile, backend, and front end in 2011. And this was right before they were releasing an app version. I think around Christmas. This was in California, so that's how. And this is how this app worked. I'm gonna try to do. So it looked a bit better, more functionality, and it worked. And literally, this was a team. Now, at this stage, I've talked to a lot of different companies, startups, and at this stage, the usual practices are, and you're going to see, I'm going to talk at all stages about the usual practices. They're about deciding on a technology and prototyping one. So if you are starting an app today, you're going to ask yourself, do we do native? Do we do React Native, Flutter, Xamarin, or some other weird technology? You're going to decide on that, and usually it's a good idea to prototype, but almost every team does this. Code reviews are almost universally a thing. I don't really see any startup who takes themselves seriously who don't do some level of code reviews. CI/CD, it's so easy to set up today. Like there's no excuse not to do it. And again, almost everyone does it. And there's some agreement on how to code and what kind of practices. So the same way that Jordan at Uber said, hey, let's do some of these things, the team usually agrees. There's no hard rules here, but there's usually some agreement, especially after we have more than 2 or 3 people on, come on, what kind of pattern should we use? And usually most teams, if you have an existing app from contractors, usually they rewrite from scratch. Like I've just seen this too many times. Again, I'm not saying this is good, but it just happens. Some stretch practices that I see fewer teams do, and they can be good, but they can also be bad because they can slow you down, or they can do it, is automated testing. I don't think this is a bad thing, by the way. I think more teams should do it, but not many do. Adding crash reporting, it's so easy. It's a line of code. You should just add it. It's helpful. And that's about it. So now we have an app that grew, and we have more engineers. We now have 3 to 10 iOS or Android engineers. So again, there will be a lot, at 3 to 10 engineers on an app, the company will typically have up to all the way to maybe 50 software engineers. And we're at the stage where the idea has been validated. In the case of Uber, we knew people wanted to do this. And now we have bigger plans. We need to ship more features, and we need to ship it faster. And at Uber, this stage looked like you can see the progression. We start to add more and more features on the screen. Now, behind the scenes, they were obviously more complex, but you see the app just started to become more and more complex, and we onboarded more engineers. And at Uber, this was special. I don't see many teams doing this. Uber invested a lot into tooling very early on. So even before it hit 10 mobile engineers, engineer number 5 was a mobile infra hire back in 2012 or 2013. CI/CD got a lot of investment. Back then, it was a lot harder to do, but we did that. And there was this thing called RFC process where we started to share what kind of, like we started to write down, when I say we, the team, I was not there at that point just yet, write down how they're going to do certain features, and they just sent it around the mobile team. It started when the team was only 5 people, and this worked really well. This grew with Uber. This was an awesome addition. Another thing that was really important at Uber is at this point, the team, when there were about 5 mobile engineers, they started to feel that there was a lot of friction with backend. And you're going to feel that as well. You want to build a feature on mobile, and you have to talk with the backend team. They need to build a new endpoint. You need to go back, blah, 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 blah. Uber made a really radical decision that would shape the architecture for a while. They decided that the priority was to move fast without having to wait on the backend, because there were fewer backend engineers at the time. And they came up with this idea called the ping. On the backend, every 5 seconds, it will send every state information over to the mobile, and mobile engineers would just add to this blob on the backend. They would be able to go there and add it. Now, this was not a great architectural approach, and it wasted a bunch of data, but it allowed the team to grow fast. So at this stage, you might want to make decisions that are not ideal, like by the book, but it helps you. This helped Uber for many years to come. Now, outside of Uber, what are usual practices where teams from 3 to 10 engineers, mobile engineers, do? Code reviews is a baseline, like you always do at this point. You need to spread the knowledge. Automated testing is also common. You're now too big to just rely on people testing everything. You have too many code paths, too many features. You need to have those automated tests, unit tests for sure, potentially end-to-end tests as well, and some other ones as well. CI/CD needs to work really good. Often you might have someone owning it. Crash reporting is a must, so which was a bit of a stretch. It's no longer a stretch. Having analytics across the app and having them implemented consistently is becoming more important as well, because now the business needs to make decisions. They need to know how this feature is performing. Is it making money, basically, sooner or later? Localization almost always becomes important. You're not just building an app typically for one market. You need to translate it or launch in different regions. And force upgrading. If you've not thought about force upgrading, meaning how to ensure that people will use your latest version of the app, how to force them, you need to do that now. You probably should have done it, by the way, on day one, but most teams were too busy thinking about that. And most teams are now regretful, but you need to put it in at this point. You're really going to need it in the later stages, but now is the time to put it in because you cannot go back on it. I have an online chapter of the book if you're interested in why force upgrading is so important. And finally, at this stage, almost everyone agrees on architecture approaches, code structure, and navigation. How we're going to do that part. Some of the stretch practices that at this point not everyone does, and again, they can be useful or they can be an overkill. Shared internal libraries. You now have 10 mobile engineers and you might have some shared code. And some teams say, hey, we think we're going to keep growing and we're going to put these into libraries. We might even open source them, which might be a bit of an overkill, but some do this. On call. You now have 10 mobile engineers. You can have a rotation where everyone goes on call, maybe like once every 2 months. And your mobile app is probably important enough to get alerted if something goes down. So some teams put this in place. Uber put this in place very early on. Feature flags, safely rolling out things without rolling them out. And if you follow what's going on, for example, on Twitter, people are reporting new features coming out because they're behind feature flags. In the later stages, everyone uses feature flags. Some teams start to use it at this point. It depends on your business, if it's worth it or if it's too much work. And finally, a stretch approach. A lot of teams at this point rewrite their app from scratch, by the way, still. So it happens. Again, Uber did not do this. We did it in the previous stage. Cool. So now, everything is going well. And, this is a very positive presentation because I'm not talking about all the times where your startup died or you stopped growing. You keep growing, right? So we had 10 engineers, but now we have a really solid business based on the app. And this means we probably will be generating at least $1 million per year, or we project, but probably a lot more because we want to hire more engineers. We want to hire like 20 more engineers next year or double the team. And what are we being asked again? To ship more features? Usually at this point, engineering leadership says, we don't want you to ship faster, but we want you to ship as fast as you have, which will become difficult because it's a lot harder to ship with 20 engineers the same way as you do with, let's say, 5 engineers. So at Uber, this was probably the stage starting between like 2014 all the way to, let's say, 2016. So this was years 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 in the company. It was increasingly fast hiring of engineers. There was like a curve that just went up on how we onboarded these people. We split what we called platform and program teams. So program teams are like feature teams. They own certain parts of the app, and platform teams owned the shared libraries that everyone else used, including in mobile, and on the back end there were services. We kept extending the existing code base, so we didn't make any radical changes. Remember how in the first or second phase, there were some architecture decisions being made? Almost always, unless you did a rewrite, you stick to that. So that actually those first 2 or 3 engineers at Uber, whatever they decided, everyone was extending on top of it. So that's where it's kind of nice to see how this goes. If you're that early engineer, you will probably have a massive impact on the mobile organization years later if you keep growing. The code structure and the build times did start to become pressing. Build times were slowing down. We saw a lot of problems on Android. We used MVP and we had huge presenters that we broke into smaller ones, but it was still a painful thing. And And feature flags and experimentation, we started to use it everywhere. We needed to use it. We had so many issues if we didn't use it. We introduced bugs that we couldn't revert. It's a baseline at almost every company. And static analysis at Uber became really important at this point. We had advanced code analysis rules. We were automating architecture decisions, et cetera, et cetera. This was specific to Uber, but it scaled really well later on as well. And in the case of Uber, this was the stage when Uber went at the 3 to 10 engineers. Uber was in 2 countries, I think. It was US and France. Uber just exploded internationally. Uber went into 30 or 40 countries really quickly, and this team was supporting it. At some point, there were more countries than I think mobile engineers per platform. So this was Uber's way of this. What usually happens at this stage? Everything at 3 to 10 engineers happens here usually. All those quality gates are already there in processes. But this is the point where almost every company introduces their first mobile platform team. Now, if you're an engineering manager and you're thinking of starting a mobile platform team, I've created I started my own mobile platform team at Uber when my organization was 30 engineers. So I did that. I'm happy to share that template. I also write about this on my book called Growing as a Mobile Engineer, which is part of, it's next to the Building Mobile Apps at Scale. But around 20 engineers is where you typically create a mobile platform team that starts to own shared things like infra, releases, some of the shared mobile functionality, code quality and governance. And later, this mobile platform team will split into multiple platform teams as well. Experimentation, feature flagging, infrastructure is key. You either buy it at this point. There's a lot of good vendors these days. A few years ago, there were not many, so a lot of companies just built their own. I would not recommend, by the way, you building your own because you're going to have maintenance hell afterwards. I mean, be my guest, but at Uber still has its in-house because that's like years old. And almost everyone invests a lot in automated testing and in manual testing because you just get regressions otherwise. When you have about 30 engineers, you really need to somehow communicate that people don't step on each other's toes. If you don't do it, people are going to ship a feature that like messes up someone else's feature. So you need to have some sort of planning process in place where teams can communicate, hey, I'm planning to do this in the code base, and some other teams can say, I'm sorry, don't do that. We're going to retire that part of the code base. Now, some of the best practices that at this stage not everyone necessarily does, having separate compliance and security expertise for mobile. At this point, you're now big. You're in multiple countries. You need to not mess things up. Some companies start to hire compliance and security mobile engineers specifically, but at this point, usually it comes later. Moving the app into a new technology or framework becomes really risky at this point, and barely anyone does it, but some teams do it. And finally, one thing that most teams don't spend too much time on at this point just yet is app performance and size monitoring. Usually that comes later. Some teams still do this. Whew. So, we're already a pretty big app. Like 30 iOS engineers building a single app, it's big. There's a lot of companies doing it, but most don't get there. Like my guess would be among all the companies, this will be maybe top 20%. But we're going on. We're now starting to become bigger. And just to give you a sense of, what are companies that have some side of mobile teams? As far as I know, Twitter engineering is about 70 Android engineers and 70 iOS engineers. So they're going to be in this next category. And that's Twitter. That's $1 billion company. iFood in Brazil has, I think, 80 engineers, I think, shared. Capital One, the one of the biggest banks in the US, have about, I think, 40 or 50 iOS and Android engineers. So this is the category we're going into. Uber is beyond this. So at this point, we are definitely a business that generates at least $10 million, but up to more than $1 billion per year in the app. Uber was the latter. When we had 50 engineers, we generated more than $1 billion per year. And there's more investment coming. And we now still need to keep shipping at a sustainable pace. So it's foolish to think that you can add double the amount of engineers and you will have double the amount of productivity, but you don't want to slow down. And this will become, and you'll see this is what the focus will be. Now at Uber at this stage, at the beginning of this, when we were about 50 engineers, the app started to become more and more complex. And you can see how, I'm trying to point on how to see it, but on the first screen, like it was already pretty bad, but there's just more and more features coming. And we call this screen, I think the go to where screen. You can see the map was tiny. There was all these features, like the UI just would not scale. And this was a point in 2016, 5 or 6 years after Uber was started. with close to 100 mobile engineers, maybe a bit under, where Uber decided to rewrite the Rider app from scratch, change every single screen, every single UX, and we did that. We did the whole rewrite in 6 months. Well, that was for the platform teams. For the program teams that I was on, because I was on just joined Uber, and I was on the payments feature team or platform team. We did the whole thing in 3 months. This was between close to 100 engineers, maybe a bit under, hard to tell, or over. It's hard for me to tell. It was about 1 million lines of code per platform. And it was a very crazy project. I wrote an article about like how crazy it was. You can read it. It's called Uber's Crazy YOLO App Rewrite from the front seat. Just Google on it and you'll find it. And we somehow did it. It's insane. It's the most insane project I've ever worked on. I think it was foolish to go that fast. There was no reason we had to have a deadline, but we had a deadline and we did it. Anyway, apart from that craziness, at this stage at Uber, we had so much more investment going into mobile infra and developer experience. We hired amazing engineers just to do this. Some of our best engineers were not working on the app, they were working on the infrastructure around the app. And this was because the bottleneck for productivity was the build times, how it was difficult to get things done. And we completely changed our mobile architecture. So I mentioned how at about the 10 to 30 engineers, we started to feel how the MVP approach did not work well. The agreeing on the architecture verbally didn't work, and even writing it down didn't work. We introduced this architecture called RIBS, which was built to scale for a lot more teams. This architecture separated modules very clearly. It had a concept of core versus optional flows. Core is something that always needed to work. 100%. That was the core part of Uber, trip taking, requesting a ride, basically. And optional was nice to have. We don't care if it dies because people can still use the app. And it was a very opinionated framework. And we invested in tooling. We had code generators, documentation, the works. At this point, we also had compliance, privacy, and security specialists for mobile, dedicated as well, who could help us. And we started to share our architecture across multiple of our apps. So this architecture went on to be shared with the driver app, parts of with the Eats app. Some of the new apps that were built started to use this as well. We also got into what I like to call feature flag hell. We had feature flags everywhere. The code was littered with if-else statements that were rolled out feature flags. We actually built a tool called Piranha to help battle this. We just added more and more analytics and monitoring because we needed to track everything at this stage. We were almost generating $1 billion per month just from the app. And yeah, that was Uber. But most companies at this point do everything, from 10 to 30 engineers, that was the typo. Plus, usually at this point, you do have multiple mobile platform teams. Uber had it and other teams have it. You need to support them. It's just the nature of mobile engineering is still a little bit immature, I think. And you need to make tooling decisions for sure. And you need to decide if you're going to buy something or build it. And these days there are better vendors, but sometimes you just need to build your own stuff and you need to hire an infra team for that. You need to introduce a way to how to introduce new technologies because you're now too big to do this in one big bang. Like Uber did it, by the way. It really hurt Uber. So we got so hurt from doing Swift this quickly that Kotlin, I think Uber still has not gone over fully to Kotlin. They're going very slow. But for example, Coinbase, another company that had about, I think, 60 or 70 mobile engineers, they moved over to React Native completely, but they did it over 2 years, and they did it in a very deliberate process. You can read an article on how they did it. So at this stage, you can't really rush. It's foolish to do so. And the only stretch practice that I know that is not common, but maybe as good as hard to sell, is UI testing at scale. Basically hundreds of UI tests, end-to-end tests. And the reason is the tooling is just not there. It's still hard to make them work reliably and in a way that's easy to maintain. But some companies are doing it. Okay, so we're almost at the stretch, which is the Mount Everest, where it's very hard to climb. I guess maybe 50 years ago, because now thousands of people have gone there. But it's still one of these peaks. There are still very, very few companies that have more than 100 mobile engineers working on one single app. Examples are Uber, the Rider app, potentially the Driver app, Facebook, obviously their main app. Messenger, for example, I think has fewer engineers from what I know. WeChat, who they have this super app, and we don't know too much about them because they're behind this firewall. I have no clue how they're doing it. Gojek and Grab, who also have their super apps. So I'm going to say there is a handful of companies. There's probably a few that I don't know about, but it's rare. It's rare to get here, and these are all billion-dollar businesses for sure. At least $1 billion per year, but probably more than this. But it's probably going to be sometimes 10 or more. There's going to be at least 30 to 50 feature teams owning parts of the app. For every feature team, you typically have like 1 or 2 native iOS and native Android engineers, and the company is still growing. And leadership says keep doing whatever you've been doing until now, which again is easier said than done. Now, what is usually happening at this point, and this is what Uber has been doing for the most part. I know that probably Facebook is doing something, but there's not many examples at this point. It's not very explored territory. Paying off tech debt becomes a continuous thing. By this point, you've accumulated so much tech debt, even from decisions you made a few years on, that keep hurting you, and you need to decide how are you going to pay that off. May this be navigation, may this be testing, deep links, anything. It could be anything based on your app. Everyone has a planning process in place that is pretty formal by now, where you have some sort of way to capture product requirements, how we're going to build a new feature, and some sort of engineering plan. At Uber, we call this PRD and ERD processes. We used to call it RFC, but we changed it. There's a very good release process. There's probably multiple people working full-time just managing the releases. And there's the process around how you do hot fixes and hot fixes. So like beta fixes or alpha fixes, as we called it at Uber. Feature flags and experimentation is everywhere, and that system becomes better. Every single company has their own experimentation system. You just cannot buy anything that's there because it's so tailored to whatever you are. In the case of Uber, we had city level mappings and vehicle categories and all that stuff. And you monitor everything, like literally every last thing you monitor. You want to know what's going on, how it's happening. You have even the smallest feature rollout will have tens of thousands of people using it, but often millions. Now, almost every company will open source their mobile related projects, so you'll get a sense of what they're doing. They will be present in the industry on conferences, events, and social media. Uber is a great example. They talk, they write on their article on what they're doing, and same thing with Grab, Facebook, others as well. But it's still, this many engineers working on one app is still not really charted territory. It's been a few years since this has been happening, and very few companies are doing it. Now, as a stretch, there is this initiative called the Mobile Native Foundation. This was founded by Lyft, and Uber is one of the founding members. I think, I don't want to say, but there's 2 or 3 other companies. This is an open forum. You can just search for Mobile Native Foundation. You see conversations and also open source projects donated to this project. This is the place where these biggest members gather and they share how they do things. You can also ask about what they do, and some engineers might I do it as a stretch because not everyone is there yet, but more and more companies are there, and it's in the open. I would very much recommend it. And as for the other usual practices, I mean, I kind of talked through most of them, but in this book, I go through into more detail. Again, there's paperback, online version as well, if you're interested. For better or worse, there's not much written on how to build these massive apps, which is why I ended up writing this book. But when I wrote it, I was secretly hoping that some people will say like, oh, hey, there's already a lot of stuff on this. Like, you could have referenced this other book or article or whatnot. There's nothing. So yeah, I wrote something. It's okay, but I think there's a lot more depth to it. So it's a good start if you're interested. And if you're working on large apps like this, please do message me if you know that's about something missing or you'd like to add something. So thanks very much for listening to me to take you on this journey, which starts small and ends in a place that is still somewhat rare. It might become more common, but I don't think it'll be every day. You can find me on Twitter. You can check out the book at mobileskill.com, and I blog on pragmaticengineer.com, and I also have a YouTube channel as well. So now I suggest let's go over to the questions.
That was amazing. Thank you very much. That was some really fascinating stuff. I just want to add that there is usually some latency between how we're talking and gets to the stream. So let's give a little time for questions to really start rolling in. While that is happening, I'm wondering, you mentioned quite a few challenges that come with scaling to over 100 mobile engineers. Do you feel like in general, getting there, being at say over 100 mobile engineers is desirable? Is that the place where you want to be?
So It's not about desire. It's about the raw reality. Almost all these companies hire so many engineers because that's where the money is. Like, it's kind of asking the question. We don't ask the question: is it desirable to have a backend team that's larger than 100 engineers? You have it because you need to all build all these things. Every company that does this, you don't really want to do it because it's hard. The tooling is not there, but that's where people these days expect your mobile app to do everything. And I know as engineers, we often think, oh, people could just use the web or something. People don't. They really don't. Uber has a really advanced mobile version, m.uber.com, that has almost the same functionality as the app. Barely anyone uses it in contrast, because they prefer doing it on the app. And on the app, you can do a few more things. You also have to deal with a lot more things like low-end devices, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I think it's just a thing. And it is hard. It's mostly hard because there's not much tooling, and few companies have done it. And even Apple and Google. So interesting, neither Apple nor Google, to the best of my knowledge, have more than 100 engineers working on any app, and they're building a lot of the tools that are used to this. They actually have small teams, pizza-sized teams.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, thank you for answering that. Yeah, I'm not yet seeing any questions on Hopin. So there's a thing that you want to learn. Maybe in your mobile engineering, like one of these categories, you're wondering what you need to do. You have questions about like what you're missing, why you should be doing one of those things. Okay, there we go. Jolt is asking, what would you suggest to a team that is transitioning the 30 dev stage, but is being reorganized from the outside with not very good communication? What can the team do to adapt?
So could you just clarify, is a question the team is transitioning, it's going into the 10 to 30?
I am not sure. Jolt, if you wouldn't mind answering that in chat while we maybe go on to another question, why that's happening. Jaroslav is asking, how did you sync mobile app with backend development? Who was the decision maker?
Yeah, so at Uber, for the most part, we let the engineers lead this discussion. So we had a contract early on with between the back and the mobile team, and it was, I think, the mobile engineers started to raise the fact that we keep waiting on mobile engineer, on back-end engineers. Back then, Uber didn't have any back-end engineers, and they got together. I think maybe a manager got involved, but for the most part, the engineers drove this decision. This was very, very early on. Later, though, Uber, like you always have this, in my observation, both at Uber and outside of Uber, back in the mobile, there's always this tension. Either the mobile team wants to move faster and says, hey, backend, why are you taking so long? Or the backend team is, oh, why do we need to keep these APIs alive? What do you mean these APIs don't work for mobile? I am kind of a believer that because the end product is mobile needs to have a very strong say. You need to be opinionated what you need and why. So I think you should be pressing there. Backend does have technical reasons, but you can work around those things. It needs to be a conversation, but ultimately you need to build something that works for mobile in terms of user experience. You should not make multiple requests or have multiple things that don't do latency and performance. And you want to add, the interesting thing is that the backend is usually very good at measuring these things and mobile is not. So you often want to do that. I think a healthy balance is where mobile engineers, some mobile engineers have some level of understanding on the backend, and they will be able to translate and also push the backend team to do this or that. Some of the best decisions I've seen, the backend team was initially not happy, but then they understood on how to do it, and then they went on supporting it. And I think we need to be empathetic. One of the biggest changes that Uber did when we wrote the app, until then, the app used to poll. Every 5 seconds, we asked the backend, hey, give me all the data. And we changed that to being pushed. So the backend would push every single status change. And we needed to work together, like with both of us. For the backend, this was a massive technical challenge because they could not lose any more packages and they needed to track. It was a complete architecture change. Yeah. So if you can, drive it from the mobile and learn a little bit on the backend. I'm someone who used to do a lot of mobile and front end at the first place, and learning about the backend really helped me collaborate better with the backend. Because you can't just say like, it's going to be like this and no discussion.
Yeah, it's a collaboration, right? Like you gotta work together. Jot got back to us and is saying that in his question, the previous one, the team is growing to above 30 people.
Okay, and then just a constraint, it was that there was not good communication?
So let me just read it out just to make sure that I get it right. What you suggest the team that is transitioning to above 30 devs, but is being reorganized from the outside with not very good communication. What can the team do to that?
Well, honestly, that's not good. I mean, you touched on the first thing when a team, it sounds like, Jolt might be on this team, and it's not like reorg. Okay, I didn't talk about reorgs. Every part of the way of this growth, reorgs will keep happening because you have more people and the old structure doesn't work anymore. If you don't reorganize, you're going to be drowned in process, or things will not be done. Now, in the good case, the reorganization is done looking ahead by people who have seen what happened. That's what happened at Uber. At Uber, this first reorg that happened at around 10 to 30 people splitting into programs and platforms, it was done by, I think, an ex-Google manager who's been at Google, seen it, and he actually laid out, here's why we're doing it. Here's how we're going to be more efficient. Here's how it's going to be painful. So first of all, it's on leadership. It needs to be well communicated. I would go back to the leaders and just, if you can, flag to them saying, hey, could you, like, we need more transparency. Could you explain the why and what to expect and what is the vision? And second of all, there needs to be a vision. Leadership needs to be clear on, here's what we're going to go, here's how we're going to do. And they should explain, like typically for reorganizing mobile teams, there's two ways to do it. You either split it out into, like, every team will have a few mobile engineers, and that's good because you're working on features, but it's bad because you're now no longer part of a big mobile team, and you might have some mobile platform teams, which you should at 30 people. You should have one, I'm pretty sure. Or the other option is you have like this big mobile team that kind of everyone comes to them to do stuff, but then you don't really know what the backend is. And there's, at 30 people, it's going to be painful. Like, you're not going to like either. You need to work through it. It's really important that you can talk with the managers, and that I think engineers should have a say, and you should have autonomy to go outside of the organizational chart to do things. So yeah, Jolt, I don't have a huge talk to the leadership, maybe point them to some of these things that will have, because there is not many ways to grow it. They need to communicate better. If you don't see it, I think you should raise this. And there should be some sort of way to feedback. And by the way, I think it's like, don't underestimate how engineers have a large say. Like, the managers are not there. They don't see what you're seeing. So if you tell them, hey, I think this would be a lot better if we, for example, kept this team together for this and this and this, and you try to reason with business saying we could ship faster, we wouldn't have to go around multiple times, we would have fewer conflicts. Basically, if you can tell them, faster shipping meaning more money, they're gonna take that into account, and they're not gonna change their mind. But what's gonna happen is the same manager who you talk to in a meeting, they're gonna say, like, you know what, my engineers are telling me that they would run faster, and they will be able to back that up. A lot of managers are not super hands-on. So you can help them with this information. So, good luck. I hope it turns out better, and I hope that communication improves.
Yeah, thanks for tackling that. That's a thorny issue. I think this was some great advice. Next, we have Pablo asking, how do you modularize? You know what I mean?
Modularize, yeah.
Yes, good. An app that big. Do you have multiple projects per feature or squad?
So I'm assuming we're talking about like the pretty big stage, like 30 to 100 or to 100, and modularizing. I don't fully ask. I'm assuming this might be features or whatnot. So I'll tackle this from two angles. One is how do we modularize like really big features that cut across the app? And I'll give you an example. When Uber said we're going to build tipping, which was really big. We were about, I think, we were more than 100 engineers at this point. We needed to build the tipping functionality in the app, and you would think it's simple, but it touched every single screen, and it involved about 20 teams of this 10 mobile teams. And we, for these large projects, we typically have a technical project manager. At Uber, we didn't have project managers, or we just had product managers per team, but they would coordinate these really big efforts. And we would agree with each of the teams. We had a planning. This was more painful because it's, more teams, you have to coordinate more, but we agreed who's going to do what, on which screen, what we're going to change, what the backend needs to change. We had these big meetings, which were super boring and hard to pay attention, but we needed to be there to make sure that everyone was there. So it's painful with these large projects. usually the way the team setup is modularized though, so like, how do people organize is, I would say, let's say for 100 engineers, about 20 would be doing mobile platform work, 20 or 30. So they own different parts of the team, but usually for mobile it's 20. So they own like shared components, networking, performance. And the remaining 80 engineers, they will be in small feature teams. So there will be 2 iOS, 2 Android engineers, and they own a feature. Let's say my larger group owned all payments, and we had a team that owned cash payments, which was a really big one. We had a team that owned Uber for Business, and they had multiple small teams. We had Uber for Family. So they owned a feature, which sometimes was just one screen, but often it was in multiple parts of the app. This is the most common way that it's split up, because what people have realized, like the engineers and engineering managers who've done this before, you need to have ownership. Like, it's really important that as an engineer, you come into work and you say, I know what I own and where I make a difference. It might be, again, like it might be this tiny feature that I own, but I know that I own that, and I own it on the mobile, but I own to make sure that it just works and people are happy for it. And that also means that sometimes mobile engineers might, do some web work or backend work, because when this stops happening and you own screens, you get these really weird apps that just don't work. Like, people are now making sure their screen is, they don't want features to move away from it, even though if it makes sense for users and so on. The one last thing, in these large companies or these large teams, the one very exciting thing, and the reason I kind of suggest that if you have an opportunity and if you're curious in your career, join a company that is large and try to join a mobile platform team. Mobile platform team becomes really interesting. It's a team where you only work with mobile engineers. Your customers are mobile engineers, and it's a whole different set of challenge that you don't encounter otherwise. You have very different kind of goals. And I just think it's super interesting. At Uber, I work with people like this, and you just learn so much that you don't have an opportunity. And later you can reuse this knowledge elsewhere as well. So just, I'm not saying go right now, but that's kind of a cool thing about these. Even if you don't work on mobile platform team, you work with mobile platform teams, and they're not that common yet in the industry.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Thank you for that too. So hopefully that answers the question of Pablo. Moving on, we still have some time. We still have some questions. So Milan is asking, you mentioned 2 rewrites during the growth. Looking back, do you think both were the right decision?
Yeah, so the first rewrite, I mean, honestly, the first rewrite decision was TK, Travis Kalanick, CEO of Uber. In 2015 on the Las Vegas party, he announced, I was not there, but there was this massive party where everyone from Uber flew in, and it was huge, party and everything. But there was this presentation where he was in a lab coat. It was a 3-hour or 4-hour long presentation. He announced Uber's 14 new values with like all sorts of, Beyonce was singing. And he also said, oh, by the way, by the end of next year, we're going to have a new app because we've outgrown the app. And everyone forgot about this. And then next year he did not, apparently. And he said like, yeah, we're still need to do it. And so we had this artificial deadline to be live with the new app by Christmas, and we had to work back. We had to get it ready by September, but it was completely artificial. There was no reason. There was no competition. Like, we were just winning, basically, as a company. We're winning business. It was not like, for example, when Facebook launched and Google thought that they would be, destroyed by Facebook. So I think it was a stupid decision to have an artificial deadline that was that strict when the team clearly could not make it. We burnt out a lot of people. We lost a lot of really good people. I had someone on my team quit. She said too much stress. She was a great engineer, and there was a lot of other people like this. So that was completely senseless. The rewrite made sense because we were outgrew it, but having that deadline for nothing, it did not. And this was a very typical kind of startup-y thing. The second rewrite was after Travis was no longer there. So Travis was the one I think like really pushed on this. It was the CEO, and the rewrite was because he said so, pretty much. Like, that was it. The second rewrite, we had to rewrite the driver app because we had a lot of issues with it. And that was a really well executed rewrite. It was a lot more gradual pace. It was gradual rollout. We asked the drivers what they thought about it. When teams were late, we kind of waited for them. It was not stressful, and the results were really good. So for the first rewrite, I don't think we really measured business results, because if we did, it would have come out that it was a fail. But the CEO said we need to rewrite. So like, he didn't ask, if it worked. So I think we lost business there, personally. With the second one, we actually gained business. So that was a good rewrite. And it was not as, it actually sometimes felt that it was a bit too slow, because we learned, my team learned from the first rewrite, and we were always ready ahead of time because we didn't want to get in the same situation. but it was so much better done. So I think that's a good rewrite. We had a business reason, we measured, we got feedback from our customers. So we listened to our customers. With the first rewrite, it was typical startup. Like, I'm surprised it kind of worked. It could have just failed, honestly, because we did not do our homework because we were rushing.
Yeah, thank you for being so transparent about your experiences and sharing all this stuff, as well as we are actually coming up on time. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your talk and for answering all our questions. We have a little special gift prepared for you. Let's see if we can get it up on screen maybe, and then we'll work on getting it to you in the real physical world. There we go.
Awesome. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you for your time and for sharing your expertise. Thanks for being here.
It was great being here. Thank you. Bye.
Cheers.